to. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you today. Of course, we are streaming on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. I want you to like and subscribe there. So many of you are joining. I'm so glad. Like and subscribe, and click that bell so that whenever we come on live, you will be notified. But we want you to share the show, continue to share the show, and share the show on my Facebook page, on the Santita Jackson and Friends page. Santita Jackson and Friends. And of course, follow me on Twitter at Santita J. At Santita J. We've got a lot of ground to cover today, a lot of ground to cover. In this first hour, we're going to talk about warrantless spy tapping in America. Yeah, FISA. What was the big fight about in Congress last week? Indeed, it seems like Trump was where many of us should be. It's something that takes us. Well, it's not like we ever really stopped. We saw that Black Lives Matter and people from the left have continued to be surveilled in America uh, without their knowledge. And we need to talk about that today. What was the fight about last week in Congress about warrantless spying? And people are saying that this will give Trump Stasi-like powers, but it's happening now. Trump is not even the president. It's happening now. So we got to talk about that. And then what happened with these pro-Palestinian protests yesterday? And now when you hear this show, 2 days before, blocking the Golden Gate Bridge, the pathway to O'Hare Airport, one of the busiest airports in the world, the bridges in New York. I mean, and on and on and on. It seems like this ceasefire protest all across the country is growing and growing and growing, and we ignore it at our peril. In the second hour, we're going to talk about our voting rights. We've heard Attorney Gerald Griggs from the president of the NAACP of Georgia. He has been standing almost by himself, but more and more people are joining when he says presses the president to get a voting rights executive order. And people are saying, like the Supreme Court when they gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, look, we have a new president. That's what John Roberts said. Chief Justice John Roberts. He said, you haven't had a black president. It's not the same America that we had 60 years ago. Is that true? New Bern, Alabama shows us something else. New Bern, Alabama, 80% black, 20% white. They have a black mayor, Patrick Braxton. Okay, is that extraordinary? No. What is extraordinary, though, is that they have not had an election for decades. And most of the town folk don't think that they are allowed to have elections. And the white power structure will not allow him to perform his duties. We got to talk about that. It's much more common. For those of you who talk about back in the civil rights days, I'm here to tell you, Attorney Darrell Jones, you'll be talking about that and really explaining our voting rights dilemmas today. In the next hour, the chairman of the Transformative Justice Coalition, of course, from the National Conference of Black Lawyers, brilliant author and civil libertarian, Attorney Mark Fancher. But we're joined by someone who I've known for so long, and I'm so glad that he's with us today. He's from the ACLU of Illinois. He's their Director of Communications and Public Policy. I've been bending his ear for 20 odd years, and it's been too long since I've seen my dear friend Ed Yanka. Ed Yanka, how are you?
I'm well, Santita. How are you today?
Listen to that voice. I love it. I love it. I love it. It is so great. Well, the House of Representatives, I had to call you because I said, what is going on here? The House of Representatives, there was a big fight about FISA. I need you to explain what that is, about warrantless spy tapping, because Common Dreams, I read it every day. This is their headline. House Dems and the GOP team up to expand warrantless spying on Americans. What does that mean? According to one of your colleagues at the ACLU, the House has voted to allow intelligence agencies to violate civil rights and liberties of Americans for years to come. Indeed, that is the fear. What happened? What was the fight? What was the fight about? Why is it that former President Trump said, do not pass this bill. This is bad business. And I think reflexively, many people either support him or don't, without asking why, what are you talking about? And tell me, Because this, so I'm just saying in today's America, even that fight has been colored with the lens of Trump.
It,
You,
it,
you know,
yeah, yeah, it's true. It's true. So at the core of this fight is really a provision of the 1970s law, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which set rules for the way in which the intelligence agencies in the United States could collect information and get, regarding people who were involved either with foreign entities or with foreign organizations. Um, After 9/11, and we should remember that power, that law, the FISA law, grew out of the abuses of COINTELPRO and things like red squads and other uses of so-called foreign intelligence, or gathering intelligence about individuals who might be involved in acts of terrorism, gathering that during the 60s and early 70s, really for nothing more than people engaging in protest against the war in Vietnam and for civil rights, and in a host of other ways. As you and I have talked about before, things like the Red Squad in Chicago that
mhm.
collected information. I have gone to see the Red Squad files that includes a file about your father in it for his activities in the city of Chicago. And FISA, sort of went along for a number of years. And then in the wake of 9/11, its powers were greatly expanded, including something called Section 702, that allows for agencies to collect information about people without a warrant. And then, and this is the most important element of it, it said that if in the collection of information regarding people involved with foreign entities or foreign persons themselves, if they came across information about American citizens, it allowed for them to use that information, to continue to collect that information, and to actually, use it for various law enforcement purposes. And that was a structure, again, that got put in place in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And, for 23 years now, we have been awaiting the day in which Congress would have and those authorities have to be periodically updated and extended. And what we have always anticipated over the last 2 decades was that at some point we were going to have a debate about whether or not those particular powers were appropriate, whether or not they're constitutional, and whether or not we should extend them and continue to use them even at the risk of Americans' privacy. And so last week, the House of Representatives, after a somewhat lengthy fight back and forth, finally voted by a majority to extend those powers for a number of years without any kind of meaningful reforms. There's a bill in the Senate that a number of senators, a bipartisan group of senators, have pushed that would, for example, require a warrant before then using or looking at information about American citizens that come from that collection. There are a number of other ideas that have been floated about correcting this or addressing, this particular power, which, one can see how easily it might be abused. And so I think that we are hopeful that it still will be, that in this process, there'll still be a moment where we can step back and look at this authority and decide whether or not, warrantless, a free-ranging warrantless surveillance program is the appropriate thing in this country. But, as of now, it's going to move forward. I should say, even over the objections of the former president, who seems to misunderstand what happened when there was an investigation into someone who was working on his campaign in 2016. And I think that again, I just hope that at some point after 20 plus years, we actually have a meaningful debate over what it means to keep ourselves safe, but do it in a way that respects constitutional norms for people all across the country.
But are we doing that? I mean, because I don't know if we've learned those lessons at Yanka. Because
Well,
we saw that during the George Floyd protests, right? You saw that the people who were surveilled were the folks who were doing the dissenting, the people who are out in the streets. Black Lives Matter. And we find that anti-war protesters, I mean, when we push back, the people we push, that the government pushes back against for treason, the people on the left, they're the whistleblowers.
right.
And it's just, and even the Red Squad, the targets were, like you said, my father. There was a man who was sent, who was really very much a part of our organization, who was sent to kill him.
Yeah.
And he actually just, he said, I had many opportunities to do it, but as I got to know your father and your mom and your kids and the people who were part of Operation Push, I just couldn't do it. Well, thank God. I mean, but that's not what happened with Fred Hampton and Mark Clark and countless others. I mean, that's where this can go, right?
Right. And so I think there's a couple of things here. You know, one of the truths is that once government has this kind of authority, it is very reluctant to ever relinquish it. And that's why, talking back in that period after the 9/11 attacks, many of us said that we ought to not expand these powers. And in fact, the 9/11 Commission ultimately argued that the additional powers that were granted weren't really necessary. And number two, I think we see that once these powers are in place, they are always going to be used against people who dissent from the government, who have voices on the outside or out of the mainstream of political thought or conventional political wisdom. And it is just the danger of allowing people to be investigated, often because of their thoughts and ideas, that we will often challenge or look to challenge those whose ideas we're suspect about.
Well, what is the fight now? I mean, was there any compromise? I mean, how did it get through? Because it was a big conflagration, and then now for 2 years.
So the fight now was really over to what extent, rather than simply extend these powers, there ought to be some sort of reform of them. And there was pressure from both political parties to do some reform. But, both the current administration, the Biden administration, as well as those in the intelligence community, continued to argue that they needed to have these authorities, they needed to have these powers in order to protect national security. I would note that 15 years ago or 16 years ago, during one of these debates, one of the United States senators actually argued that these powers were probably unconstitutional and weren't necessary for national security or public safety. That senator was Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm. So
the fight is really over whether or not we're going to continue this program unchecked, or whether we're going to put the usual kinds of warrant requirements and other sorts of checks in place to ensure that we don't have people's information being gathered, being stored, being collected, being analyzed as American citizens without a warrant.
do you think, I mean, because everyone, I mean, even Common Dream said, we don't want Trump to have these powers, but do we want any president to have these powers?
So I would argue no. The ACLU fought against these powers when it was George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump and now Joe Biden. The problem isn't with the administration that's using them. The problem is with a law enforcement bureaucracy that is able to sort of rifle through the papers, the belongings, the other kind of private matters of American citizens without having to have a warrant, without having to have any kind of oversight whatsoever.
But I'm still, this still makes me uneasy, Edyanka, because because now we're living through a moment, and I certainly will ask Daryl Jones and Attorney Mark Fancher first, you to join in, where we shut down, I mean, pro-Palestinian, well, should I say, people who supported the ceasefire, that really, most specifically, they shut down many of the major American thoroughfares on Monday. Um, and with all of the cameras everywhere, one just has to wonder where this is going, because you have a time where America is just full of dissenters, if you will, on the right and the left. And I'm wondering where all of this is going, Ed, because because given my own background coming out of the civil rights movement, um, which is ongoing, it's never stopped. I mean, that you're surveilled, and for what? But every time you have these right wing attacks, and they're the ones who blow up things, they're the ones who upend elections and all of that. They're never surveilled. I mean, what is this?
Well, let me say a couple of things. I think your question really spurs for me. The first thing is, of course, that where we're going, unfortunately, is towards towards sort of an unchecked or unfettered, in many places, an unchecked and unfettered surveillance society, in which cameras, along with biometric information, facial recognition technology, and other things, automatic license plate readers, all of these things create a trail of where we are, who we're with, what we're doing, how we're engaged in our day, in a way that I think is not the kind of power that any of us have ever sought to give over to the government to sort of track us in that way. But the other thing is that we have reached what I think is an unfortunate point in many ways, in which we seem to fear protest as opposed to embrace it or listen to it or consider the messages of protesters. We have the Democratic National Convention coming up in Chicago this summer. And there's a resolution being considered by our city council this week, an ordinance that will set security zones in certain places and have penalties, criminal penalties, for violating certain rules inside those zones. And they can't even tell you today, as they pass the ordinance, where the zones are, when they'll know where they are, how they will notify people where they are, and what the objects are that you can bring in and out of the thing. So that just lends itself to the kinds of biased enforcement of these things, where certain people with certain messages will end up being punished and other people who have different messages won't be. And I fear that this all comes back to a way in which there's a power structure in the country that does not like to be challenged by anybody, and they therefore reject anything that looks like demonstration and protest and voices that are raised against them in ways that make them feel insecure in their power. And that is a sad reality that I think we just have to continue to work through and fight against, as we always have. But I think we're finding that, once again, all of these questions that we thought were resolved in so many ways just have never really gone away.
Never. I mean, it's like the Civil War was still fighting it. The 2020 election was still litigating it, if you will. And what is unsettling is that we are still here, because in real time, Black Lives Matter has been surveilled. In real time, people who promote peace, they're being surveilled. And you even see people who participated in what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. They're saying, wait a minute, all of us didn't riot that day. And then you see there were intelligence people who were there. It was just, there is a lot going on here, and there's a lot to unpack, and it is very unsettling. And I just don't want the waters to be muddied here. Ed Yonka, Director of Public Policy at the Illinois ACLU, and their Director of Communications. I don't want the waters to be muddied, because so much of the media made this about Trump. And I said,
Right,
this is not
right.
about him. This is about your civil liberties. This is about your right to protest. This is about your right to privacy, your right to not be checked. I don't want England. That's the most heavily surveilled society on earth. I mean, 30 years ago, you'd walk through London and they had a clear photograph or video images of you. I don't want that. I,
But Santita, let me say two things. First, we've reached that point in Chicago. As you
yeah,
know, on Michigan Avenue, if you start out at Roosevelt Road and you walk all the way to the Magnificent Mile on Michigan Avenue, you will be on a camera every single step of that walk.
yeah,
And the second thing I would say is I think you're right. This is not about Donald Trump. It's not about a presidential candidate. Every single person who's hearing our voice ought to be calling their members of Congress and their senators and saying that we need reform of Section 702 before we renew FISA. Congress ought to be able to do this work. Congress ought to be able to assess what is and is not necessary 20 years on from 9/11 and just operate under the simple premise that before an American's personal papers are collected, stored, analyzed, that there ought to be a warrant, that there ought to be some sort of an independent third party who makes an assessment that that's the appropriate thing to do.
Mark Fancher, what say you?
Well, I think that as far as I'm concerned, and from what I see, regardless of what the laws are, regardless of what the constitutional protections are supposed to be, there are certain communities, certain people in this country who never have those rights, and they never have had them. That essentially what America is, it's a collection of very powerful interests, powerful people, individuals, families, major corporations that really control everything. And the law is structured to protect them and to protect their interests. And then there are everyday people who are supportive of this group and who do nothing to challenge this group, who accept the crumbs from the table that this group gives them, who accept the so called American dream that allows them to live a life that is reasonably comfortable, and they don't make trouble and they don't make waves. These are people whose so called rights are protected. There are other people who are regarded as a threat to the interests of the oligarchy. These are people who are dissenters and protesters, people who are self-styled revolutionaries. These are people who are out there trying to, in some ways, destabilize the status quo, who are trying to, in some cases, overthrow it or destroy it. And these are people who don't have rights. There are other people who don't have a political agenda, communities that don't have a political agenda, but because of their poverty, because they are targets of racism, because they are in other ways oppressed or exploited, they too are regarded as a threat. And they at any time can be triggered into destabilizing things. Maybe the police will shoot somebody and they'll come up and step up and start to burn down a city. Or maybe they will, in other ways, engage in so called crimes in order to try and survive. And if those crimes touch the people who are protected by the established way of doing things, by the law, by the oligarchy, then they too should be punished. And these are communities that are under constant surveillance because they don't want these people to disrupt things for whatever reason. And so when we get to something like FISA, you see that it requires, number one, that, or it expects that, number one, the machinery of government is going to be used to protect the oligarchy and its interests from those from outside of the country who in some way threaten it. So it gives great leeway to the intelligence agencies and others to monitor and surveil those who are outside of the country, people who are non-citizens. But at a certain point, when the Fourth Amendment and other, constitutional amendments and the Bill of Rights somehow interfere with the intelligence agencies and with law enforcement's efforts to maintain surveillance of people who are citizens, people who are domestic residents, then in some way, there has to be a way around that. And so the intelligence agencies and the police are always looking for an angle, always looking for a way to get around the constitutional provisions that presumably protect everybody, but which really don't as a practical matter. And so when FISA was enacted, initially, we didn't have email and the internet to the extent that we have it now. But once the use of email became prevalent, even among the presumed targets of FISA, and they found that many of those the email accounts were serviced by U.S.-based corporations, it became necessary for Section 702 to go into effect to make it possible for them to get access to these emails that without necessarily having to get a warrant because these were American companies. But lo and behold, now that you can get access to these emails without a warrant, it makes it possible for you to look at these emails that may be going back and forth between the targets of the so-called targets of the surveillance and U.S. citizens and U.S. residents who are supposed to be protected by the Fourth Amendment. But since you've got these emails, you can look at them. And it's another way around the constitutional protections that are supposed to protect people. And they're always doing that. And when they can't find an angle, when they can't find a lawful angle to do it, they just blatantly violate constitutional rights and just do whatever, the heck they want to do. And then deal with the consequences later if they're ever sued about it or if they're taken to task about it by politicians. So that's what this is really all about. It's about protecting the interests of the oligarchy by whatever means. And they have a variety of different ways of doing it. Some of us call it the intelligence police industrial complex. They all work together in order to ensure that the powerful continue to preserve and maintain their power. And in my view, there's no reforming that because no matter what you do as far as reforming the law or changing the law, they're still going to violate it. They'll find a way to violate it. And really the only way is to just overthrow them.
Wow. Before you respond, Ed Yonka, Daryl Jones, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear the whole conversation because I think that when we go back and we think of 2001 and what then kicks off after the attack on the Trade Center, it seems as though it was at that point that prior to that Americans were really protective of their information and wanted to be certain that our information was not out there, that the government wasn't just gathering our information and doing whatever they wanted to do with it. Subsequent to that, I think the feeling collectively was that it was more important to give some temporary room so that the government could protect us internationally, and that was our concern. And once that door was open, it seemed as though it just then became kicked open, and America never came back to the point of saying, "Stop getting my information." Enough is it. We're beyond that point. Let's close this door, and that door has never closed. And if anything, it's become wider. And it's now done generally in the name of saying, well, we're protecting you. This is done to protect you. And this is what we need to do. And, yesterday we had a conversation with regards to Netanyahu and Israel. And in that conversation, we were saying this was being done to protect the people of Israel, although, in a much larger sense, they weren't as protected now as they were prior to those types of actions that were taken by Netanyahu with regards to Gaza and the various areas. I think a similar and parallel argument applies here, in that, it was done in the name of protecting us Americans, protecting our country. And initially, I think, I certainly bought in hook, line, and sinker that we needed to do whatever we needed to do to be certain that our country was protected from international terrorists and those that are trying to gather our information. But now that it has really turned inward and they're getting our information about us individually, and it's really not serving that purpose, but it's serving their greater governmental purpose of really just monitoring everything that we have and everything that we're doing. I'm not certain that we've caught up to saying this needs to be stopped. And that's the reason that we see Congress moving in the fashion that it has, because they believe that they're moving in the interest of the American people, because in the American mind, these are things that, we don't like it, but it's necessary to protect us. And that's where, Ed, Yanka, and Mark, and everyone else comes in and say, no, this ain't so, and that's the educational campaign that I think we've got to be on now, is how do we reel this back in to protect our information, Santita?
Ed, Yanka, it's because we've learned nothing from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and his life. I mean, if you want to see someone who in his 13-year ministry, public ministry, he was under investigation by the IRS. He lived under audit. He was the most dangerous man in America. He lived under complete surveillance by the FBI and the CIA. Same can be said for Malcolm X. You can look at the Chicago 7. I mean, that's one of the things, as you bring up the Democratic Convention here, which everybody's telegraphing. Look, we are going to have a very active convention. If you think things are going to be happening inside of the convention, wait till you come outside. People are, they are getting ready to come here to dissent. The most American of things, right? Isn't that what Teddy Roosevelt said? Hey, this is what you're supposed to do. And they're not doing it to be violent. I mean, of course, my parents were involved in this. The only time Dr. King had a march that was upended by violence, it was started by a young Black man who went to Morehouse, Dr. King's alma mater, who was affiliated with the CIA. I mean, that was more than 50 years ago, but we continue to do this. I mean, when I look at a Chelsea Manning, when I look at a Ned Snowden, when I see people who say, hey, we're committing war crimes, when I see people who say, we don't need to go into this war, when I see people who say, I don't think that you should kill George Floyd, when I even see you shouldn't shoot Dexter Reed 96 times in 41 seconds, you should have a presumption of innocence at Yanka. I don't see these people with the appropriate checks. And there was not that discussion. We're still siding with the oligarchs, whether we know it or not.
Yeah, your comments and Mark's analysis, I think, of the roots of this kind of surveillance are persuasive in that way, in that this kind of surveillance is clearly intended to support a power structure, an oligarchy, a corporate structure, and to sort of keep the lid on from, being able to have a real movements that would work towards not just social justice, but economic justice in many ways, shape, and form. And so I think that all of that is, I think is really persuasive and true. And I can't help but think I find myself a little bit in an odd situation in this dialogue of being a little bit of the moderate one, because my sense is that these systems are in place. How do we peel back some of it? How do we reform some of it? And there is the question that I think hangs over all of this is to whether or not you can do that as opposed to just deconstruct the systems themselves. And I think that's certainly a conversation that's worth having. And I think the other element of all of this, and it goes to the point that both Mark and Daryl raised, is that, we also, in some ways, we're also doing this. We're trying to have this conversation at a moment when both the ability to do this kind of collection and data collection is expanding greatly, right? Mm-hmm. Number one, I remember in the post 9/11 period, as we would have the debates over the Patriot Act, an FBI agent in Chicago once told me that when he was a young FBI agent, his job was to go and get phone records from AT&T once a week. Mm-hmm. So he would go over to the AT&T place and he'd get a carton of phone records. That's what the FBI would get for that week or for that mm-hmm. day, for however many days. As he said, now with the click of a mouse, they send millions of records to us. Mm-hmm. And so we're trying to talk about this or control this against that. And as Daryl pointed out, I think at a time when people have all but abandoned a sense of what privacy means and having privacy in their papers or et cetera, because we share all of our information with third-party apps, with Google, with fill in the blank. And so how do we, I think I feel a bit of frustration here in that how do we confront these systems in a time when we both have to educate people about why privacy matters and fight against those traditional forces that have always been in place who've wanted to surveil people who they deem to be a threat.
And I don't think you're the odd person out. One of the conversations I've had with my mother, who is a civil rights veteran, who's been one of the persons who's been surveilled. She said, "Oh, be very clear. America has its enemies, and this is where we live." So you do need to know what people are doing. The challenge is, though, and I don't just sit here having been with the freedom fighters all of my life. What I've really tried to do is I've never had politics where I win, you lose. I think that there's a way. All we're trying to do is make the system right, Ed. We're trying to get things right. What is concerning to me is that all the people who blow up the things, the people who were in Washington on January 6th, 2021, it wasn't anyone on the left. And then so at least the front of the story that is given to us of now we're just trying to find out who they are. If I am marching for voting rights, you know who I am before I leave my home. Because you have checked all my email, you've surveilled my phone calls, and this has been ongoing. And I'm saying part of the problem that I have with all of this is whom they go after, whom they surveil. I don't like to see this. I don't like to see people anywhere on the political spectrum violated. I don't like to see it, but that's what I see. And because we've not had a meaningful discussion and debate about it, no one's an outlier here. You're not an outlier. You just you're like, I'm looking at this, I'm looking at that. Put all that on the table. We've got to have that, Ed.
Well, I'm reminded, that actually most Patriot Act.
Oh, okay.
Including most of the powers in the Patriot Act, including Section 702, were actually proposed in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing. But mm-hmm. Congress rejected them because they said it was too far. But after the terrorist attack on 9/11, they decided that they would, that this was the appropriate response to that. And I think in some ways, that it does demonstrate these forces are always there that want this power. There's always this desire to surveil more, to oversee more, to look for more. And we just have to continue to push back on it in every way that we're capable of.
What words do you want to leave us with? And what are our marching orders? Because this is here.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. Where do we go from here? What do we do?
Yeah. I would say, the first and foremost thing is I think people ought to actually, whether it's through the ACLU.org or other sites, is look at actually what the powers are of Section 702 and why people are concerned about them. And then I would say, that we should all reach out to our elected members of Congress in both chambers and just say that these powers should not be extended without meaningful efforts to engage in reform.
Just very quickly, what are those powers? If you can kind of.
Again, the power is, and I think Mark described this incredibly well, is that what Section 702 did is it allowed the government, when they surveil overseas or foreign agents or foreign actors, to allow them to collect also information from American citizens and American residents, and in that same thing, and not have to cull that information out, that they still get to look at that, they get to investigate it, and they get to seize that information without any warrant requirement that would normally attach to someone who was in the United States.
Well, and it happens within our borders. it, it just happens habitually to people um, who are looking to be free, who are looking to be equal. And that's what, if it were evenly applied, I'd still have an issue with it.
Yeah.
But because it's not equally applied, you're not the outlier. You're helping us to see all the pieces, Edyanka. I'm sending you and your family so much love today.
Thank you, Santita. It was good to see you, and Mark and Daryl. It's always good to be with you.
Look, I can't wait to see you in person.
Yes, soon.
All right. I'm putting that out there. Sending you so much love. Something for us to think about, everybody. Call your representatives right away. Edyanka gave you the marching orders. Attorney Mark Fancher and Attorney Daryl Jones, stirring conversation about that. Here we are. It's like it's never stopped. We have about 10 minutes left here. You see the Golden Gate Bridge, the thoroughfare to O'Hare Airport. People missed their planes yesterday. They had to bring porta potties onto the bridge in New York because you couldn't move. The ceasefire protesters, Mark Fancher, are out. We act as if it has gone somewhere, and it has not. I mean, are you surprised that now it seems like they're taking to the streets?
Oh, no, not at all. But, I have a very deep and profound concern that is inspired by the Star Wars movie series, which I'll get back to in a minute. And that is that we're in an amazing historical moment. The entire world is waking up. It's striking back in ways that those with power are not accustomed to at all. The international understanding of Zionism now is at an all-time high. People are able to see the stark contradictions and appreciate it, and they've accurately targeted those who need to be targeted without being distracted and confused by things like charges of anti-Semitism and other things which have been effectively used in the past to cloud the issue. They understand that it is a function of imperialism and imperial power, and that it has to be attacked. And that's everywhere. It's not just in the Middle East, it's around the world, including in this country. So these protesters are part of something that's happening globally. And that's an amazing and powerful thing. We also, at the same time, see what's happening in West Africa, in the Sahel, where unprecedented action is taking place, where in Niger and Mali, and now Senegal and other places in Western Africa, they're telling the European powers, get out. Take your militaries with you. You're not welcome to our resources. Get out and don't come back. We have not seen that happen. And they're also saying, if you dare to attack my neighboring country, we got their back. We're standing firm and we're standing united as Africans against imperialism. We've not
Nigeria. They want the United States to get out.
Oh, yes.
That's a gathering storm there as well.
Oh, yes. The French are already gone. And now the U.S., they're telling them to get out too. And then you see things happen such as where Israel gratuitously and unprovoked goes and attacks Iran. And then Iran says, well, no, you're going to strike us. We're going to hit you back. Okay. This is all unprecedented. This is something that the empire is not accustomed to. And it has, for the moment, retreated. It has, for the moment, yielded. It has, for the moment, stepped back. But I'm not comfortable, not for one moment, that they're going to continue to rest. I do think, as in the Star Wars series, the Empire will strike back. And it's just a question of when, and it's a question of how. But I think that those of us who are people of goodwill, those of us who want to see an end to imperialism, we make a grave error if we rest, if we're comfortable, and we, in some ways, do not believe that the empire will strike back. We're not ready for it. We're not prepared for it. And we don't even accept the idea that it is so vicious that it will come at us with a vengeance.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that's my concern. Yes, it's great that people are out in the streets and that they continue to push the issue, but I am concerned that they do this with a clear understanding of what comes next, and that they're gearing up and preparing for that as well.
Do you think that they are?
I think that there are elements of them are.
Mm-hmm.
There are some who are, but there are others who I think are still blissfully ignorant, who still believe that if they get out and they protest enough, that somehow the political establishment will have an epiphany and they will see the wrongness of their actions and that they will somehow bring about the reforms that people are chanting about. That's not going to happen. And I think that we're at a disadvantage when we have large numbers of people who really believe that the system is going to listen to them and is going to respond to their protests.
Yeah, I get the sense, because people, because you hear that, Daryl and Mark, when you hear people talk about, well, back in the 60s, during the civil rights days, the civil rights movement, I'm like, honey, it never stopped.
Mhm.
You went on a march and you stopped. And you more than likely didn't go on that march because Dr. King didn't have 250,000 people marching with him. Most of the time, not even 100. That's not how this works. But you do see what I have noticed, Mark and Attorney Mark Fancher and Attorney Daryl Jones. Daryl, it's even when I talk to these young organizers, they're not even reluctant. They will not tell you what they're going to do next, because I think that they have a mistrust of the security state, because that's what we're in a security police state. And they believe that. So when you ask them, well, how can we meet you on the next protest? They're like, just follow us. We're not going to give you any heads up on anything, because on Monday morning, everybody was. If you had known that the thoroughfare to O'Hare Airport, one of the busiest airports on earth, was going to be blocked, I promise you, before the Lord, people would have been there very early. No. People missed those planes.
Right.
They had to bring porta potties onto the bridge I think in San Francisco and in New York, because they just brought traffic to a standstill. So what say you? What do you think this might portend for Chicago in the summer?
Oh, wow. Great question, Santita. And I lay it out like this. A little earlier, you just were asking Mark, what did he think was happening? It's warming up. My analysis: the weather's warming up. It's the spring is coming. People are more inclined now to come on out and let loose with regards to their protests in the streets, and I think that's what you're beginning to see. But it's not just that the weather is warming up. You have what's happening in Gaza. You have a situation where the government doesn't seem to be listening to what the people are saying. And you have all of this coming together. And it's not just, protesters in general, but these are young protesters that are coming into the streets and having their voices raised. And they're not going to stop there. This is the beginning of what these young folks are protesting about. This is just the beginning. Their beginning part is to try to get the attention. They've done things on election-wise to show the Biden administration that they're not supporting them, that there's an issue that's here. It's fallen on deaf ears. They're now taking this next step of putting their bodies in the way, of stopping traffic, of being, the blockade to force people to stop and listen. And the question is, will the Biden administration listen? The answer is probably not. And so the question then will become, what next? So it's not a one-off type of situation that I think we're experiencing. I think that what we're experiencing now is that our young voters have realized that they can impact this system. And they can impact it through the power of voting. They can impact it through the power of getting the message out. The reason they don't put the message out about where they're going before it happens is exactly what you said. They don't want anybody to stop it. You know, if you know that I'm a baseball guy, if you know a curveball is coming, you can prepare yourself to hit the curveball. You know, part of their power is in the folks not knowing where it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen. And so they're using their the virtues and all the devices dealing with social media to be able to get the information out to one another, to try to be under the radar. So there's a surprise element that hits when they go to the Golden Gate Bridge, when they go to, you know, the various other sites that the airports, lay their bodies down to stop traffic, to stop planes, and all of this other stuff. They want to be certain they have that impact of what's happening, but they don't stop, because it's a full service. I think it's very comprehensive, because they're also talking about the vote. They're also talking about uncommitted. They're also talking about, let's look for another candidate. Let's figure out what we can do. So, you know, so Santita, you know, it's my belief that, you know, as the weather warms up, as Chicago and the DNC gets closer, you're going to see it even ramped up even more. You know, will there be 30,000 protesters? I don't know. But one thing I feel confident saying is that you're going, so long as there are young people being killed in Gaza with weapons that have been manufactured by the United States, you're going to have some U.S. people that are going to be out there saying no, and being in Chicago to be certain that their message is heard on what will be the biggest stage in our country during that DNC, Santita.
Don't sleep on Milwaukee.
That's true.
I mean, we don't know what's going to happen with the Republicans. I just think that Americans are in that kind of mood on the right and the left. Remember, in Wisconsin, 48,000 Americans, Democrats, voted for uncommitted. 12,000 Republicans did too. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the loudest voices for not intervening in these conflicts is Rand Paul. You don't have to support him, but you know the merits of some of his arguments. I embrace. You know, I think we have got to grow beyond our silos, and wherever we can find common cause with people, Attorney Mark Fancher and Attorney Darrell Jones, I'm going to do it because I want peace, and I know peace is possible. And more than that, I know peace is God's way, not quiet, but peace, which means you got to have justice. You can't have famine. You can't have colonialism. You can't be surveilling people. You can't have a red squad. You can't have a J. Edgar Hoover. You can't. Well, hold on now. We have to re-examine who we are. We have to re-examine, maybe examine, because you know, some of us have done that. I think our young people have. That is why they're protesting the way that they are, because they have a healthy mistrust of the establishment. They've seen a lot. They've seen a lot. As my mother said, everything changed when they killed JFK in the middle of the streets, because she was alive at the time. She was in college. She said, you never saw the country never recovered. It became a different place, because if they would do that to him, Dr. King said when they killed JFK, I won't make it through the decade, and he didn't. Mm-hmm. Oh, God bless you, everybody. Let's talk about New Bern, Alabama. I wish you could stay around for that, Mark Fancher, but I'm telling you, Darrell Jones will be leading that discussion. New Bern, Alabama, 80% black, 20% white. They have a black mayor, but the white power structure will not allow him to carry out his duties. Please, most of the residents didn't even know that elections were allowed. They didn't even think they could vote in 2024. Back with more of the Santita Jackson Show right here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. And you thought you didn't need a Voting Rights Act, an executive order on that. You better get